I'm Claire Bishop, 37 years old, and I enlisted in the Army at 18 out of a mill town that never expected much of me. And years later, I was awarded the Medal of Honor. For most of my life, I gave my family everything I had and asked for almost nothing back. Even as they treated my service like a costume, I refused to take off. But the night a steward at the officers' club waved me toward the kitchen, and a 4-star general stood up and saluted me, I finally understood something I had spent 20 years avoiding. Have you ever been overlooked by the very people who should have seen you first? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The summer I turned 18, my father measured my future in calluses. He stood at the kitchen counter of our small mill-town house, turning my hands over in his, and told me I had soft palms and a soft head to match. He meant it as a kind of love, I think. In our family, you were either useful or you were decoration, and the only way to prove you were useful was to come home with grease under your fingernails and a paycheck you could point to. My brother Wesley had both. I had neither, and I was about to make it worse. I told them at dinner, I said I had signed the papers that morning, that I was going into the Army, that I would leave for basic training in 6 weeks. My mother set down her fork. My father did not argue. Arguing would have meant he thought there was something to argue about. He just shrugged, the way he shrugged at weather he could not change, and went back to his plate. Wesley laughed. He was 22 then, 3 years older than me, already a shift lead at the regional distribution center, already the standard against which the rest of my life would be quietly graded. He said it would be a phase. He said I would be home by Christmas, crying about the food. He said a uniform was just a costume you were not allowed to take off. To understand why that line landed the way it did, you have to understand the house I grew up in. My father had worked the same mill floor for 31 years, and he wore those years on his body the way other men wear medals. Bad knees, a ruined shoulder, 2 fingers that never closed all the way after a machine took part of them in the winter of 1994. To him, those injuries were the proof of a life well spent. Work was the thing you could see and touch and hold up to the light. Anything you could not weigh in your hands, he treated as a hobby at best, and a delusion at worst. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired one, and tired men do not have the imagination to picture a kind of courage that does not leave a mark you can point to. Wesley fit that house like a hand fits a glove. He was good with engines, good with his mouth, good at the particular kind of loud confidence that small towns mistake for substance. When he brought home his first real paycheck from the distribution center, my father framed the pay stub. I'm not exaggerating. It hung on the kitchen wall in a dollar store frame, a piece of paper with a number on it, and every time I walked past it, I understood, without anyone needing to say it, what my family considered worth framing. I have a citation now, signed by the President of the United States. It has never hung on that wall. I stopped needing it a long time ago, but I would be lying if I said the pay stub did not teach me something about where I stood. I did not cry about the food. I did not come home by Christmas. But I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about how I proved my brother wrong. It took me a long time to understand that proving him wrong was never going to fix anything, and that the people who need you to perform your worth for them are not actually waiting to be impressed. They are waiting for you to stop. I am going to tell you about a night not long ago when a man at the door of an officers' club waved me toward the kitchen because he could not imagine I belonged anywhere else. And I am going to tell you what the highest-ranking person in that room did about it without my saying a single word. But before any of that, you need to know who taught me to expect the kitchen. I left for basic in the late summer of 2007. I was 18 years old, and I had never been farther from home than the county line. The first months are a blur of early mornings and aching shoulders, but somewhere in that blur, I found something I had never had at our kitchen table. People looked at what I did, and they adjusted their opinion of me accordingly. Nobody cared who my brother was. Nobody cared that my hands had been soft. The only question that mattered was whether I carried my weight, and I found, to my own surprise, that I could. By the spring of 2008, I had earned my first stripes and my first real assignment. By 2009, I was a specialist. I sent money home. When my mother needed a procedure the insurance would not fully cover, I quietly paid the difference, and I never mentioned it, and nobody ever asked where it came from. When Wesley needed help moving into a new apartment, my mother called me at my unit to ask if I could get leave to come lift boxes. She did not ask what I was doing that week. It did not occur to anyone that I might be doing anything. I learned slowly not to expect the question. I did my work, and I let the silence be the silence. In the early part of 2010, I made sergeant, and I met the person who would become the closest friend I have ever had. Her name was Dana Nolan. She was a non-commissioned officer in my unit, a few years older, with a flat voice and a way of looking at you that made excuses dry up in your mouth. She never once told me I was brave. She never told me I was special. The first time we worked together, she handed me my gear and assumed I would carry my weight, and that assumption, that plain expectation of competence, was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. Where my family saw a girl playing dress-up, Dana saw a sergeant. That was all. It was everything. There is a specific memory from those first 2 years that I return to more than any other. It was a field exercise, somewhere cold, the kind of training that strips you down to whoever you actually are when you are exhausted and miserable and far from anyone who loves you. We had been awake for the better part of 2 days. A younger soldier in my squad, a kid barely out of high school, had hit the wall that everyone hits eventually, the place where your body simply refuses to take another step. The instructors were watching to see what the rest of us would do. I took half his load onto my own back without thinking about it, and I talked him through the last several miles, one footfall at a time. And when we finally stopped, he looked at me like I had done something extraordinary. I had not. I had only refused to leave someone behind. But in that moment, I understood that this was a place where refusing to leave someone behind was the highest thing you could do, and where doing it was noticed and named and remembered. My whole life, I had been told my instincts were soft. Out there, in the cold, those same instincts were the thing that mattered most. Nobody back home would ever have believed it. I stopped needing them to. I folded my uniform every night in that quiet barracks room with more care than anyone at home had ever folded a single thought about me. I did not know yet that the care would be tested. I did not know that the next year would take everything I had and ask for more. I only knew that for the first time in my life, I had stopped auditioning, and the relief of it was so large I mistook it for happiness. It was not happiness yet, but it was the beginning of the road that got me there. The dismissals never came all at once. That is the thing people misunderstand about being overlooked by your own family. It is not a single cruel act you can point to and name. It is 1,000 small subtractions, each one too small to protest, that add up over years into the certainty that you are the least important person in every room you share with the people who raised you. I felt it sharpest on a Thanksgiving phone call in the late autumn of 2010. I called home from my unit, proud because I had just pinned on my sergeant stripes and I wanted, just once, to say it out loud to the people who made me. Wesley had news of his own that week. He had been promoted to supervisor at the distribution center, and the whole table was celebrating him. When the phone came around to me and I mentioned my promotion, my father said, "That's nice, sweetheart," in the same tone he might use for a weather report. And then he asked if I had heard about Wesley's new truck. I learned that night that there was no promotion high enough to interrupt a story about my brother. I was 21 years old, and I stopped expecting to be the headline of any conversation in that house. There was a smaller moment that same winter that I have never told anyone because it sounds like nothing when you say it out loud. My mother sent a care package to the unit, the first one she had ever sent. I was thrilled. I tore it open in front of the others, the way you do when you finally have proof that someone at home is thinking of you. Inside was a tin of cookies, a pair of socks, and a card. And the card was not addressed to me. It was a leftover birthday card meant for Wesley, with his name crossed out and mine written above it in pen. I do not think she even noticed she had done it. That somehow made it worse. There was no malice in it. There was just a household so organized around my brother that even the apology cards came addressed to him first. I ate the cookies, I wore the socks until they fell apart, and I put the card at the bottom of my footlocker, and I did not look at it again. But I knew it was there, the way you know a bruise is there, even when you are not pressing on it. That is the thing about being the second child in a family that only has room for one. You learn to live on the part of the love that is left over after the important person has been served. And you tell yourself it is enough, because the alternative, admitting it is not enough, is a door you are too afraid to open. The next year, The workups began for the deployment that would change my life. The training was serious, and the stakes were real, and I threw myself into it the way you throw yourself into work when work is the only place your worth is not up for debate. In the middle of one of those grinding weeks, my mother left a voicemail. It was not about me. It was about Wesley, who was moving apartments again, and whether I could maybe come home for a weekend to help. I stood in a motor pool with my gear half-staged for a mission rehearsal, and I listened to my mother ask me to come lift boxes, and I did not even feel angry. I felt the particular tiredness of a person who has stopped expecting to be seen. Before we shipped out, I wrote my parents a real letter. Not a postcard, a real one. I told them where I was going, in the careful, unalarming way you are allowed to, and I tried to tell them what it meant to me, that I had found a place where I mattered. The reply came weeks later, 2 lines long, 1 sentence about the weather back home, 1 sentence about Wesley's promotion. I read it twice, looking for myself in it, and I was not there. So I folded it up and slid it into a cargo pocket and carried it into a place it had no business going. The way you carry a stone in your shoe because you have forgotten how to walk without it. The night before the convoy that would become the worst and most important day of my life, Dana found me rereading that thin letter by the light of a headlamp. She did not ask what it was. She seemed to already know. She sat down beside me on the edge of the cot, and she said the thing that I would spend the next 15 years slowly learning how to believe. You keep auditioning for people who already left the theater, she said. Stop. The people next to you in the truck, those are your people now. They will see you. They are the only ones who have to. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. You keep auditioning for people who already left the theater. It is the most accurate description of my first 30 years that I have ever heard. I had been performing my whole life for an audience of 3, and the seats had been empty for a long time, and I had kept performing anyway, into the dark, because the alternative was admitting that the show was over and that I would have to learn to live for myself. Dana saw it before I did. She had a way of saying the hardest true thing in the flattest possible voice, so that it landed not as a wound, but as a fact you could finally do something about. I did not answer her. I did not know how. But I folded the letter back up, and for the first time, I did not put it in my pocket. I left it in my locker. I walked out to the trucks the next morning carrying only what I needed, and what I needed did not include the opinion of anyone who had never bothered to ask me a single real question. I did not understand yet that I was about to earn something that would force the whole world to ask. I only knew that the silence from home had finally stopped sounding like a verdict and started sounding like an answer I was free to ignore. I am going to skip past the part you might expect me to dwell on, the deployment itself, because the day that mattered is the one that arrives in this story later when it is finally explained out loud by a man with 4 stars on his shoulders. For now, it is enough to say that something happened overseas in the late spring of 2011 that the Army decided was worth its highest honor, and that I came home with fewer friends than I left with. And that for 2 years afterward, I told almost no one what the small pale blue ribbon at my collar actually was. I want to take you forward now, past all of that, to a Friday evening this past spring, in the month of May, 2026. I was 37 years old. I had been commissioned as an officer years earlier, after finishing my degree, and I wore the bars of a captain. And I had been invited as a guest of honor to a formal dinner at the Officers Club on post because the keynote speaker that night was a 4-star general, and someone on the planning committee had decided that the club's guest list ought to include the only person on the installation who wore the Medal of Honor. I arrived early. I have always arrived early. It is a habit from a life spent making sure I was never the reason anything was late. The club was an old building, all dark wood and brass fittings and white tablecloths, the kind of room that smells like polish and history. Senior officers were gathering in clusters, holding drinks, their dress uniforms crisp under the warm light. At my own collar, beneath my chin, sat the ribbon. Pale blue, 5 small white stars. The room was busy and loud, and nobody was looking closely at the woman who had just come through the door. Nobody except the head steward. His name, I would learn later, was Roland Pike. He had worked the floor of that club for 30 years, a trim man in his middle 50s in a black vest with the brisk, proprietary manner of someone who believes he runs the room. He saw an unfamiliar woman standing just inside the entrance, getting her bearings, and his mind reached the conclusion it had reached 10,000 times before, without ever once being wrong enough to learn from it. He decided I was catering staff who had come in the wrong door. I should tell you that I was not in a costume, to borrow my brother's old word. I was in my dress uniform, pressed and correct, every ribbon in its place, the bars of a captain on my shoulders for anyone who cared to look. A person who looked, really looked, even for 2 full seconds, would have seen an officer. But that is exactly the point I am trying to make about my whole life. Roland Pike did not look for 2 seconds. He looked for less than 1, and in that fraction of a second his mind supplied the answer it had always supplied. The answer the world supplies about a woman it does not immediately recognize, which is that she must be there to serve, and not to be served. He did not check. He did not look at my collar. He lifted one hand and waved me toward the back of the room, toward the swinging doors that led to the kitchen, and he said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "Kitchen staff enters through the back, honey. Service doors around the side." At a nearby table, a small cluster of junior officers chuckled. Not cruelly, just the easy, reflexive laugh of people who assume a thing is funny because a confident man has said it like it is. I want to tell you that it stung. I think a younger version of me would have wanted it to sting, would have wanted the wound so she could be righteous about it. But the truth is, it did not. 20 years earlier, in a kitchen with my father, turning my soft hands over in his, that exact feeling had nearly broken me. This time it did not even land. I had been waved off by experts. I had been waved off by the people who raised me for decades at every dinner and every phone call and every milestone. A steward was an amateur. He had no idea who he was waving off, and the strange, quiet thing I felt was not anger. It was almost tenderness. He simply had not looked. Most people do not. So I did not correct him. I did not announce myself. I did not reach for the ribbon at my collar or recite a single line of my own history. I just stopped where I was, and I stayed, and I let the moment sit in the room like a held breath. Pike, irritated now that the woman he had directed was not moving, opened his mouth to repeat himself. He never got the chance. From the head table at the front of the room, the keynote speaker had been watching. He was a 4-star general, the highest-ranking person in the building by a wide margin, a man with a chest full of ribbons of his own, and a name that everyone in that room knew. His name was Lawrence Tate. And 15 years earlier, in the spring of 2011, he had been a colonel, the commander of the task force on the ground the day I earned the ribbon at my collar. He had signed the recommendation himself. He set down his glass. The small clink of it on the table was the only sound he made, and yet somehow the room began to quiet around it. He stood. He was a tall man, and he rose slowly and deliberately, and he came to attention. And then General Lawrence Tate, 4 stars on each shoulder, raised his hand to his brow and rendered a salute. Not a casual one. A slow, formal, deliberate salute, held, the first salute, the one that every member of the armed forces, regardless of rank, owes to a recipient of the Medal of Honor. "That woman," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of that suddenly silent room, "wears the Medal of Honor." The room turned. I watched the understanding move across their faces like wind across a field, table by table, as officers found the pale blue ribbon at my collar and registered what it was. And then they began to rise. One by one, and then in a wave, every officer in that club stood and came to attention and raised their hand in salute. Toward me, toward the woman who had just been told the service door was around the side. I want to slow down here, because this is the moment the whole night turned on, and I have replayed it enough times to know exactly what I felt. It was not vindication, though I had every right to it. It was not even surprise, not really. What I felt, standing in the center of 100 raised hands, was a kind of vertigo. For 37 years, the world had been telling me in 1,000 small ways that I belonged at the back of the room, and here was the highest-ranking person in the building. A man who had nothing to gain and nothing to prove, telling the entire room the opposite with the most formal gesture the military has. 2 truths cannot both be the floor of your life. One of them had to give. And in that long-held salute, the old one finally did. A general does not render the first salute lightly. It is not a courtesy or a flourish. It is the institution itself, through one man's raised hand, declaring that what this person did matters more than the difference in their ranks. Every officer in that room understood the grammar of it instantly, which is why they stood. They were not standing for me, exactly. They were standing for the thing the medal represents, the line a person is willing to walk across when walking across it could cost them everything. But I was the one wearing it, so I was the one they faced. And Roland Pike, the head steward, stood frozen at the center of it, his hand still half lifted toward the kitchen, until slowly, it dropped to his side. The seconds after a moment like that do not feel triumphant. I think people expect them to. I think if you had told the 18-year-old in that Milltown kitchen that one day a 4-star general would stand and salute her in front of a room full of officers, she would have imagined fireworks going off inside her chest. There were no fireworks. There was a strange ringing stillness, and 100 raised hands, and a steward going pale, and underneath all of it a single clear thought, which was that I wished Dana could see this, and that I did not need a single other thing. The first person to reach me was not the general. It was a man in a dark suit who came hurrying across the floor with his face the color of the tablecloths. He introduced himself as Howard Quinn, the general manager of the club, and he was apologizing before he finished his own name, the words tumbling over each other. He was mortified. He kept glancing back toward Pike, and I could see him assembling the decision in real time, could see the word forming on his lips before he said it. He was going to fire the man, on the spot, in front of everyone. "Captain, I am so deeply sorry. This is unacceptable. I will handle Mr. Pike immediately. He will be collecting his things tonight. I promise you that this—" I raised one hand, the same small gesture, and he stopped. "Mr. Quinn," I said. "He made an assumption. People make them. Do not end a man's 30-year job over the worst 30 seconds of his night. I am asking you not to." Quinn stared at me as if I had spoken a language he did not know. I understood the look. We are taught that the satisfying ending is the one where the person who wronged us pays. But I had spent my whole life on the receiving end of people deciding what I was worth at a glance, and I knew something Quinn did not. Firing Roland Pike would not have made me larger. It would only have made me one more person in his life who decided his whole value in 30 seconds. There was something else underneath my decision, something I did not fully understand until later. I had spent my whole life being defined by a single glance, by people who looked at a soft-handed girl or an unfamiliar woman in a doorway, and decided that was the whole story. I knew, better than almost anyone, how small a person becomes when the world reduces them to one bad moment. Roland Pike had reduced me to one. If I turned around and reduced him to one in return, I would simply be passing the cruelty along, handing it down the line the way it had always been handed to me. I did not want to win the night by becoming the thing that had made all my nights hard. The medal at my collar was given to me for refusing to leave people behind in the worst moment of their lives. It would have been a strange way to honor it, to leave a man behind in the worst moment of his. So I asked Quinn to let him stay, and I watched the request confuse him because it did not fit the story he expected, the story where the wronged person extracts a price. I was learning to live outside that story. It had taken me long enough. By then General Tate had crossed the room. He took my hand in both of his, and he did not let go right away. He looked at me the way you look at someone you have not seen in a long time and were not sure you would see again. "Captain Bishop," he said, "I have thought about that day more than you know." He turned, then, to the officers nearest us, the ones still standing, and he told them, plainly without drama, the way the best soldiers tell the truest things. He told them what I had done in the spring of 2011, the 4 soldiers I had pulled out of a place no one should have walked into once, let alone 4 times. He did not embellish it. He did not need to. "I have saluted 3 Medal of Honor recipients in my life," he said. "I commanded the ground she earned hers on. Remember her face." I had not seen General Tate in person in many years, not since the ceremony, and time had grayed him and slowed him a little, but his eyes were exactly as I remembered them, steady, unhurried. He had been a colonel when I knew him, a brigade commander with a reputation for caring more about his soldiers than about his own next promotion, and the 4 stars had not changed that about him. While the rest of the room was still finding its seats, he leaned in and said, quietly, "Just for me. I read your name on a guest list this morning, and I told my aide I would be standing up tonight, whether or not the moment was convenient. I did not expect a steward to hand me the moment on a platter. There was the ghost of a smile in it. He did you a discourtesy and the room a favor. They will not forget what they saw. Neither will I." I thanked him. I did not trust my voice to say much more than that. Across the room, I could see Lieutenant Vance, the young aide, watching the whole thing with the wide, fixed attention of someone who knows she is witnessing something she will tell her own soldiers about one day. I recognized that look, too. I had worn it myself, a long time ago, watching people I admired do the right thing without being asked. I drove home alone that night. I rolled the windows down and let the spring air move through the car, and somewhere on the dark road between the post and my house, I finally exhaled. I had been waiting, I realized, to feel vindicated. What I felt instead was tired, and underneath the tired, something quieter and warmer, like a debt I never knew I was owed, had just been paid in full by a stranger's reflex. When I got home, I called Dana. It was late, but she answered the way she always answered, on the second ring, with no hello. I told her what had happened, the kitchen, the wave, the laugh, and then the general standing, and the whole room rising. She laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh, and then she went very quiet. "The steward sent you to the kitchen," she said finally, and a 4-star stood up. "Claire, that is the whole story of your family in one room. The only difference is that this time somebody else said it out loud." I sat in my dark kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I felt the truth of it settle into me. For my whole life, the people who were supposed to see me had waved me toward the back, and I had gone, quietly, again and again, because I did not believe I had the standing to do anything else. And it had taken a stranger with 4 stars to stand up and name what they had refused to name. The medal had never been the point. The standing up was the point. And I was 37 years old before I let myself understand that I was allowed to stand up too. Word of that night traveled the way these things travel on a military post, which is to say quickly and with embellishment. By the following week, half the installation seemed to have heard some version of it. A young second lieutenant who had been in the room that night, Sophia Vance, the general's own aide, wrote a short and respectful account of the moment and shared it. She did not post a photograph of me. She simply described what she had witnessed, a steward's mistake and a general's correction, and the way an entire room had risen. The base newspaper asked if I would sit for an interview. I declined the spotlight, but I allowed them a single accurate paragraph, because I had learned that the truth told plainly takes up less room than a lie, and I no longer felt the need to make myself small. What I did not expect was the phone call from my brother. Wesley called on a Tuesday evening. He had heard, in the way family hears things, a garbled second-hand version, something about a general and Claire and a fancy dinner and a fuss. And the first thing I noticed, the thing that told me nothing had really changed, was the shape of his questions. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask what I had done to be standing in that room in the first place. He asked whether it was a big deal. He asked whether people would hear about it. He asked in a roundabout way whether it reflected well on the family, on him. "So this medal thing," he said, and I could hear him feeling his way carefully across unfamiliar ground. "It's, what, a real big deal medal." I stood in my kitchen, and I looked out the window at the dark yard, and I thought about 13 years of dinners where no one had asked me that question. The medal had been awarded in 2013. He had sat in the audience. He had clapped. And in all the years since, not once had he asked me what it was for. "It's the biggest one there is, Wes," I said. "It's the highest award this country gives. You've had 13 years to ask me what it was for. Tonight is not the night I explain it to you." There was a silence on the line. I had never spoken to him like that. I had spent my whole life softening my edges so the rest of them could feel tall, translating my own accomplishments into something small enough to fit beside Wesley's truck and Wesley's promotion. And I was done. Not angry, just done. It is hard to describe how strange those words felt in my mouth, because for 37 years I had practiced the opposite. I had practiced making myself convenient. When my father forgot my promotions, I had told myself he was tired. When my mother addressed my care package to my brother, I had told myself it was an honest mistake. When Wesley turned every one of my achievements into a setup for a joke, I had laughed along because laughing along was cheaper than the fight. I had built an entire personality out of being easy to overlook, and then I had spent my nights wondering why no one ever looked. The cruelty of it, the part I am still untangling, is that I had been complicit in my own disappearance. I'm not the family afterthought anymore, I told him. I'm not the punchline. I love you. The door is open, but you don't get to walk through it as the brother who never asked. You walk through it as an adult who finally did. He tried then, the thing he had always done, the thing that had always worked. He reached for guilt. He brought up our aging mother. He suggested gently that I was making the whole thing about myself, that I had always been a little dramatic, that maybe I was enjoying the attention. And I waited for the old reflex to rise in me, the reflex to apologize, to shrink, to smooth it over so the family could go back to its comfortable shape. It did not come. I had left that reflex on a dark road weeks earlier, and I did not go looking for it. I'm not raising my voice, I said, and I was not. And I'm not going to keep offering to be smaller so everyone else can feel tall. That part is over, Wes. Whenever you're ready to actually know me, I'll be here. But I'm not going to chase it anymore. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. My hands were steady. I had said the thing I had needed to say for 20 years, and I had said it once, plainly, and I had not taken it back. That, I was learning, was what a boundary actually was. Not a wall, not a punishment, just a line you stop apologizing for. What I had not anticipated was what my silence would do to the rest of the family. For my whole life, I had been the one who smoothed things over. I was the one who softened the hard edges, who translated everyone's grievances, who made sure the family's story about itself stayed comfortable. When I stopped, the story cracked. It cracked first at a cousin's barbecue in early summer, a gathering I did not attend. I heard about it afterward from Dana, who heard about it from a relative. An uncle of mine, a man who had served himself decades earlier and who actually understood what the pale blue ribbon meant, cornered Wesley by the grill and asked him point blank to explain what his sister had done to earn it. He was not being cruel. He was genuinely proud and genuinely curious, and he assumed, reasonably, that her own brother would know. Wesley did not know. He had never asked. And standing there in front of the family, the man who had spent his whole life as the household's gold standard, the one who mattered, the one whose truck and whose promotion interrupted every conversation, had nothing to say. He could not tell the story because he had never bothered to learn it. The silence where his answer should have been was, I am told, very loud. He called a mutual relative afterward, fishing, trying to figure out how badly it reflected on him that he had not known. And for the first time in my life, I saw my brother from the outside. Not as the towering figure of my childhood, but as a man whose entire sense of himself had been built on being the one who counted, now wobbling because the ground had shifted under him. He was discovering, at 41, that being the loudest person at the table is not the same as being the most important, and that the sister he had filed away as decoration had been carrying something he could not even name. My mother called me a few days after the barbecue. Her voice was careful, the way it gets when she is approaching something she does not have the words for. She did not apologize, not in any direct way. My mother is not a woman who knows how to say she was wrong, but she asked me haltingly whether I would tell her sometime about what I did. And then she said something that has stayed with me. She said, I think I spent so many years worried about your brother that I forgot to be curious about you. You never gave me any trouble. I suppose I mistook that for not needing me. It was not a perfect thing to say. It put a little of the weight back on me, the way she always did. But there was something real underneath it, a crack of genuine recognition, and I decided to meet the real part and let the rest go. I told her I would tell her the story when I was ready, and that I would like her to be ready to hear it too. She said she would try. From my mother, try is a large word. I would like to tell you that I felt triumphant. I did not. What I felt, to my own surprise, was a distant and uncomplicated pity. I knew what it was to have the floor drop out of your sense of yourself. I had just spent 15 years climbing out of exactly that hole. I did not wish it on him. I simply stopped reaching down to pull him out of everyone he dug. In the meantime, I went about my work on post, and the work was steadying in the way it had always been. One afternoon, a young enlisted soldier, barely 19, stopped me in a hallway. She had clearly been working up the nerve. She asked me shyly if it was true, the story about the steward and the kitchen. I told her it was. "Wasn't that humiliating, ma'am?" she asked. I thought about it before I answered, because she deserved a real answer. "Honestly," I said, "it was familiar. People have been waving me toward the kitchen my whole life. The steward wasn't the new part. The new part was the room standing up. And it took me far too long to learn that I didn't have to wait for a room to stand. I could have been standing the whole time." She nodded slowly, the way young people nod when you have handed them something they will not understand for another 10 years. I recognized the nod. I had given it to Dana once on the edge of a cot the night before everything changed. Dana came to visit not long after. We sat on my porch in the long blue evening with 2 glasses of iced tea sweating on the railing, not saying much. The way old soldiers can sit together for an hour and exchange more in the quiet than most people manage in a year of talking. After a while, she set down her glass and looked at me. "You spent 20 years thinking the problem was that they couldn't see you," she said. "It wasn't. The problem was that you kept dimming yourself so they wouldn't have to look directly at anything. You made yourself easy to overlook, and then you blamed them for overlooking you. I wanted to argue. I could not. She was right, and she had been right for 20 years, and she had loved me enough to keep saying it until I was finally ready to hear it. When did you get so wise?" I said. "Same day you got so stubborn," she said. "We were both there. You just weren't listening yet." "You know what I keep thinking about," I said after a while. "The kid who asked me if it was humiliating, 19 years old, and I told her the steward wasn't the new part, the room standing was. But that's only half of it. The other half is that I waited my whole life for a room to stand, when the thing I actually needed was to stop measuring myself by whether anyone stood at all." Dana nodded slowly. "Took you long enough." "It did." "You want my honest opinion?" She did not wait for me to say yes, because Dana never waits for permission, to be honest. "The general standing up was a beautiful thing. I'd have given a month's pay to see it, but it didn't change who you are. You were exactly the same woman 1 second before he stood as 1 second after. The medal didn't make you. The day you earned it didn't make you either. It just showed everybody what was already there. The only person who needed to finally see it was you." I thought about that. The breeze moved through the trees at the edge of the yard. Somewhere down the street, a screen door banged and a dog barked twice and went quiet. We watched the light go out of the sky. I did not feel the need to fill the silence. For the first time in my life, the quiet did not sound like a verdict. It sounded like peace. It was Wesley who finally crossed the distance, though it took him most of the summer to do it. He showed up at my house on a weeknight, unannounced, holding a cheap bottle of wine he clearly did not know was cheap. He stood on my porch looking like a man who had rehearsed something in the car and forgotten all of it the moment the door opened. He did not lead with an apology. I think if he had, I would not have believed it. Instead, he led with the only thing that could have actually reached me. "Will you tell me what actually happened over there?" he said. "In 2011. I never asked. In 13 years, I never once asked you, and I should have. I'd like to know, if you'll tell me." It was the right question. It was 13 years late, and it was the right question, and the rightness of it undid something in my chest that I had been holding closed for a very long time. I let him in. I poured the wine he had brought into 2 mismatched glasses, and then for the first time I told a member of my family the truth of that day. I told it the way I had learned to tell true things, plainly, without drama, without reaching for his reaction. I told him about the ambush in the spring of 2011, about the vehicle that was hit, about the 4 soldiers pinned in a place that was taking fire from 3 sides. I told him about going back. Once, and then again, and then a third time, and a fourth, because each time there was one more person who could not get out on their own. I told him about the 2 who did not make it home regardless, and how I still carried their names. I told him that I did not feel like a hero, that I had felt mostly terror, and that the medal had always seemed to me less like a reward and more like a weight I had agreed to carry on behalf of people who could not. I told him about the heat and the noise, which is the thing nobody warns you about. How a firefight is not the clean, choreographed thing you see in films, but a wall of sound so total it lives in your chest for days afterward. I told him about the weight of a grown man in full gear when he cannot help you carry himself, and how you learn that the distance between cover and open ground, a distance you could stroll in 10 seconds in a parking lot, becomes the longest journey in the world when it is being measured in the space between one breath and the breath you are not sure you will get to take. I told him about the third trip back, the one I should not have made, the one where the math said, stay, and something older than math said, go. And I told him about the names I carry, the two who did not come home no matter what I did, and how a medal does not feel like a prize when it is pinned to a chest that is mostly thinking about the people who are not there to see it. Wesley listened. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect the conversation to himself. He sat in my kitchen with a glass of cheap wine he never drank, and he listened to his sister the whole way to the end, and when I finished, he had nothing to say, and for once the nothing was the right response. I didn't know, he said finally, and his voice was not steady. Claire, I didn't know any of that. I made you into a joke for years, and you were... He could not finish it. I let him not finish it. You asked the right question tonight, I said. I'm not going to pretend the last 20 years didn't cost me something. They did. One good conversation doesn't erase it. But you asked, so we can start from there. Slowly. He nodded. He asked, before he left, whether he might come to the next event where the post honored me, not to be seen. He said, not to stand near the important people, but just to finally see me. I told him yes, on one condition, that he came as my brother and not as a spectator. He said he understood. I think for the first time he actually did. He left the bottle on the counter, unopened. We had talked until past midnight, the two of us, for the first time in our entire lives. It was not everything. It was a door, opened an inch. But I had spent so long believing the door was bricked over that an inch felt like a flood of light. Some weeks later, I went back to the officers' club for an official function, and I saw Roland Pike again. He was still employed there. He was still working the floor in his black vest, because I had asked Howard Quinn to keep him on, and Quinn, to his credit, had honored the request. When Pike saw me come in, something crossed his face, and partway through the evening, he approached me, holding his hands in front of him. His manner entirely changed from the brisk certainty of that first night. Captain, he said, I owe you a proper apology, and I've been dreading the chance to give it, which I suppose means I needed to give it. I've waved 1,000 people to their seats in 30 years in this room, and I never once really looked at a single one of them. You were the first person who ever made me ashamed of that. I looked at him, this man who had decided what I was worth in a single careless glance, and who had spent weeks since then learning something it had taken my own family 13 years to begin to learn. You didn't see me, I said, because you weren't looking. Most people aren't. That's not the worst thing about a person. The worst thing is when you find out and you decide not to change. I paused. You found out, so change. Start looking at the people you waved past. Do that, and you'll be a better man than the one who sent me to the kitchen. That man did me a favor in the end. He gave a general a reason to stand up. He told me, before he turned to go, a little about himself, the way people sometimes do when they have finally set down something heavy. He had started at the club as a young man, almost 30 years earlier, and somewhere in those decades the faces had blurred into a single, endless line of people to be seated, fed, and ushered out. He had stopped seeing individuals a long time ago. It was not malice, he said. It was the slow erosion that happens to anyone who does the same thing 10,000 times. And he said that the worst part of that night was not the embarrassment of the salute. The worst part was realizing, in the silence after the general stood, how many people he must have waved past in 30 years, who deserved a second look he never gave them. I keep thinking, he said, about all the ones who didn't have a general in the room to set me straight. It was, I thought, a more honest reckoning than my own family had managed in 13 years. I told him so, gently. I told him that the measure of a man is not whether he makes the wrong assumption, because everyone does, but what he does the morning after he learns he was wrong. I told him he was doing the right thing with it, and that this was rarer than he knew. Pike's eyes were wet. He nodded, and he thanked me, and he went back to his floor, and I watched him, the rest of that evening, actually looking at the people he seated. It was a small thing. But the world is mostly made of small things, and a man who starts looking is not a small thing at all. A few days after that, a letter arrived. It was short and formal, on heavy paper, from General Lawrence Tate, who was rotating to a new command across the country. He wrote that in a long career, he had stood at attention in a great many rooms, for flags, and for fallen soldiers, and for presidents. And he wrote that, of all the rooms he had ever stood up in, he was proudest of the one where he had stood up for me. I read it twice. Then I folded it, carefully, the way I fold everything that matters, and I put it somewhere safe. I thought, when I put it away, about all the folded paper in my life. The thin 2-line letter from my parents that I had carried into a war zone in a cargo pocket because I could not let go of wanting them to see me. The citation signed by a president, which had never hung on the kitchen wall beside my brother's framed pay stub. And now this, a 4-star general's note, heavy paper, and a few honest lines telling me he was proudest of the room where he had stood up for me. It struck me that I had spent a lifetime collecting evidence of my own worth and storing it in drawers, as if one day I would assemble it all and present it to the people who raised me, and they would finally understand. I did not need the evidence anymore. I kept the letter not as proof for anyone else, but because it was kind, and because a kind thing honestly meant is worth keeping. That is a different reason than the one that made me carry the cargo pocket letter. It took me 37 years to learn the difference between keeping something because it proves you matter and keeping something because it is simply good. I went back to the club one last time before the season changed for a quiet function, and afterward I stood for a moment in the empty room. The tables were being cleared, the white cloths glowed faintly in the low light. And I looked at the head table, at the ordinary chair where, one spring evening, a 4-star general had set down his glass and risen to his feet for a woman, a steward, had just waved toward the kitchen. I used to think I was waiting for my family to finally see me. Standing there in that empty room, I understood that I had stopped waiting a long time ago, somewhere on a dark road with the windows down, and that the question had quietly changed underneath me without my noticing. The question was no longer whether they would ever see me. The question was what I wanted to do with a life that no longer required them to. It was the best question anyone had ever handed me, and a steward had handed it to me without knowing. The dinner that finally felt like an answer was not at the officers' club. It was at my own house, months later, on an ordinary evening with the windows open and something simple on the stove. Wesley came as a brother. He helped set the table without being asked, which he had never done in his life. My mother came too, softer than I had seen her in years, and at some point during the meal she set down her fork the way she had set it down 20 years earlier in that Milltown kitchen, except that this time it was not in disappointment. She asked me quietly if I would tell the story of the medal again, not because anyone had pressured her to, and not as a courtesy. She asked because she wanted finally to hear it. And the whole table turned toward me, and they were not turning out of politeness. They were listening. I watched my family across that table, and I let myself notice how ordinary it all was. Wesley arguing with Dana about a football game, my mother fussing over whether the food was warm enough, the clink of mismatched glasses, the scrape of chairs, the small, comfortable noise of people who have decided, at last, to be in a room together. There was no parade, there was no grand apology that erased 20 years in a single speech. The wrong of it was too old and too layered for any one evening to undo, and I had stopped wanting it undone in a single evening. What I wanted and what I got was smaller and far more durable. I wanted to sit at a table where I was seen, and I did. And the seeing did not depend on a medal or a general or a room full of officers rising to their feet. It only depended on a few people finally choosing to look. Dana was there, because Dana is always there. She sat at the end of the table, ribbing me about something. The easy old friendship that had never once needed me to dim myself. The friendship that had seen me clearly from the first day in a motor pool when she handed me my gear and assumed I would carry my weight. Near the end of the night, she raised her glass. "To the only person I would walk back into fire for," she said. Twice. I want to tell you what peace actually feels like, because I spent so many years imagining it would arrive like a parade, loud and unmistakable, the world finally admitting it had been wrong about me. It does not arrive like that. It arrives like a quiet you stop bracing against. One morning you notice that you are not waiting anymore. You are not listening for the verdict. You are not translating yourself into something small enough to be acceptable. You just are, and you matter, and the mattering does not depend on anyone in the room standing up. So if you have spent your life being waved toward the kitchen by people who never once bothered to look at you, I want you to hear me, because I know exactly where you are standing. You do not have to wait for the room to rise. You do not have to earn the highest medal in the land and wait 15 years for a 4-star general to say your name out loud. You were already someone worth standing for, on the very first day in the very first kitchen, before you ever proved a single thing to anyone. I think about Roland Pike sometimes, still seating people at that old club, actually looking at them now. I think about my brother, learning at 41 how to ask a question he should have asked at 28. I think about a general who carried the memory of one spring morning for 15 years and stood up the moment he could. And I think about the 18-year-old in a Milltown kitchen with soft hands, who was already worth standing for and did not know it, and would not know it for a very long time. You do not have to wait as long as I did. That is the only thing I really came here to tell you. The day you finally believe that is the day the kitchen door stops being an insult and starts being just a door. If you have ever worn something you earned the hard way and watched someone decide, at a glance, that you did not belong in the room, then you already know how this story feels from the inside. So let me ask you, were you ever waved toward the kitchen in your own way by people who never bothered to look? Did you wait, like I did, for a room to finally stand when the person who most needed to see you was you? And if you had been in that club that night, what would you have done when the general rose? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this story found you somewhere tender, hit like and subscribe so you never feel like the only one who has ever stood quietly in a room full of people who would not look.